The entire first-class cabin fell silent as Terrence Washington's expensive suit soaked with red wine. The flight attendant stood frozen, empty glass in hand, fake apology on lips. But nobody expected what happened when his 10-year-old granddaughters stood up, determination blazing in their identical brown eyes. Before I continue this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about everyday heroes standing up against discrimination. Trust me, what these twin girls did next will completely change how you think about fighting injustice. Terrence Washington had never been handed anything in life. At 72 years old, the self-made billionaire had climbed from the depths of poverty in rural Alabama to the pinnacle of corporate America through sheer determination and intellect. His journey began as a janitor at a small tech company in the 1970 seconds, mopping floors at night while attending community college classes during the day. Despite facing constant discrimination and barriers, Terrence absorbed every bit of knowledge he could, eventually earning an engineering degree and developing his first software program. That first innovation, a simple program to help visually impaired students read digital text, became the foundation of Washington Technologies, now a Fortune 500 company specializing in educational accessibility software. From that single program developed in his tiny apartment, Terrence had built an empire that employed thousands across the country, revolutionizing how students with disabilities accessed education. Education is the great equalizer, Terrence often said in interviews, a philosophy that guided both his business decisions and personal life. Dignity and respect should be available to everyone, regardless of where they started. Despite his tremendous wealth, Forbes estimated his net worth at just over $3 billion. Terrence remained humble. He still drove a 5-year-old American sedan and lived in the same renovated Victorian house he had purchased 20 years ago when his company first became profitable. The only obvious upgrades to his lifestyle came after tragedy struck his family 3 years ago when his only daughter and her husband died in a car accident, leaving Terrence to raise their twin daughters, Zoe and Amara. The girls, now 10 years old, were the light of his life. Brilliant like their mother and observant like their grandfather, they noticed everything. Zoe, older by 7 minutes, had her grandfather's analytical mind and could often be found programming simple games on her tablet. Amara, the more socially perceptive twin, could read a room better than most adults. Together, they formed a formidable team, fiercely protective of their grandfather despite their young age. They had seen how people sometimes treated him, the sideways glances when he entered luxury stores, the security guards who followed him a little too closely, the restaurant hosts who assumed he was there to pick up rather than dine in. Though Terrence had achieved more success than most could dream of, being a black man in America meant he still faced racism regularly. "Remember your worth," he would tell his granddaughters whenever they witnessed such incidents. Never let anyone make you feel small. Today was supposed to be a proud day for the Washington family. They were flying from their home in Chicago to San Francisco, where Terrence would receive the prestigious Global Humanitarian Business Award for his company's work developing free educational software for underserved communities worldwide. The twins had helped him pack his acceptance speech, written on the same type of index cards he had used since his first business presentation decades ago. "You're going to be amazing," Grandpa Amara had assured him that morning as they boarded the private car to O'Hare International Airport. "They're gonna love you," Zoe added, straightening his tie with the serious expression she wore when concentrating. The family had arrived at the airport with plenty of time, moving efficiently through the priority security line with their first-class tickets. The twins were excited. They didn't travel often, as Terrence preferred to stay close to home since becoming their guardian. This trip was special, though, a chance for them to see their grandfather honored for his life's work. As they boarded the plane, Terrence guided the girls to their seats in the first row of first class, helping them stow their backpacks and get settled. It was then that they first encountered Heather Brooks, the lead flight attendant for the first-class cabin. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge as she approached their row. "These seats are for first-class passengers only." Terrence simply smiled and handed over their boarding passes. "Yes, we're aware. These are our assigned seats. Heather's eyes widened slightly as she scanned the boarding passes, clearly surprised. I see, she replied, her tone shifting to something artificially sweet. My apologies, sir. As she walked away, Zoe and Amara exchanged glances. They had seen that look before: the surprise, the quick recalibration, the forced politeness. Their grandfather pretended not to notice, instead helping the girls with their seatbelts and showing them how to use the entertainment systems. Remember, he whispered to them as the remaining passengers filed past, how people treat you says more about them than it does about you. The twins nodded, but their eyes followed Heather as she warmly greeted other first-class passengers, her smile genuine for them in a way it hadn't been for their grandfather. The flight to San Francisco would take 4.5 hours. They didn't yet know it would change their lives forever. The first-class cabin of Flight 1382 to San Francisco resembled an exclusive club with its wide leather seats and spacious aisles. Most passengers were dressed in business attire, men in tailored suits and women in elegant blazers tapping away on laptops or scrolling through phones before takeoff. Terrence fit perfectly among them in his custom navy suit and polished Oxfords, yet something set him apart. He was one of only 2 black passengers in the first-class cabin. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Heather Brooks moved efficiently through the cabin, taking drink orders from each passenger with practiced charm. Her blonde ponytail swung as she leaned in to hear requests over the engine noise, laughing at a joke from a middle-aged white executive in 2C, touching the shoulder of an elderly white woman in 3A while complimenting her. Brooch. When she reached the white businessman sitting across the aisle from the Washington family, Heather's customer service was impeccable. Good afternoon, sir. What can I get for you today? We have a lovely selection of wines if you're interested. The man ordered a scotch on the rocks, and Heather assured him she'd be right back with his drink. Then, without acknowledging Terrence or the twins, she moved on to the passengers behind them. She skipped us, Zoe whispered, furrowing her brow. Maybe she didn't see us, Amara suggested, though her tone indicated she didn't believe that. Terrence placed a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. It's all right. She'll come back around. But as minutes passed, and Heather returned with drinks for everyone else in the first-class cabin, the oversight became impossible to ignore. The twins watched as she deliberately avoided making eye contact with their grandfather, moving past their row as if it were empty. This has happened before, hasn't it? Grandpa Zoe asked quietly, noticing how unsurprised he seemed by the treatment. Terrence nodded slightly, memories flickering behind his eyes. He recalled the board meeting 20 years ago when, despite being the CEO, executives directed their comments to his white deputy instead of him. The time 5 years ago when he was mistaken for a server at his own company gala. The countless times he'd been followed by security in high-end stores while shopping for gifts for his late wife. When you've lived as long as I have, he told the girls softly, you learn to pick your battles. Sometimes dignity means not giving others the reaction they expect. The twins exchanged a look, having one of those silent conversations that only people who had shared a womb could have. Their grandfather had taught them about resilience, about rising above prejudice rather than being consumed by it. But they'd also inherited his sense of justice. After nearly 30 minutes, when every other passenger had been served, Terrence finally raised his hand as Heather passed by again. Excuse me, he said politely. We haven't had a chance to order yet. Heather stopped, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. Oh, I must have missed you. First time in first class. The question carried an unmistakable implication. No, Terrence replied evenly, not rising to the bait. We'll take 2 apple juices for my granddaughters and a club soda with lime for myself, please. Instead of accepting the order, Heather's eyes flicked down to his boarding pass, still visible in the seat pocket. May I see that for a moment? Just need to verify your seat assignment. Around them, several passengers shifted uncomfortably. A white woman across the aisle frowned slightly, while the businessman who had received prompt service became suddenly engrossed in his magazine. No one said anything as Heather scrutinized Terrence's boarding pass, checking and rechecking as if hoping to find some discrepancy. Everything appears to be in order, she finally concluded, returning the boarding pass. I'll bring those drinks right away, sir. As she walked away, Amara reached for her grandfather's hand. That wasn't fair. Life rarely is, sweetheart, Terrence replied, squeezing her small fingers in his. But we don't let unfairness define us. Zoe, however, was watching Heather with narrowed eyes, her analytical mind clearly processing something. Just because you choose dignity doesn't mean she should get away with disrespect, she said, with a wisdom beyond her years. Terrence looked at his granddaughters, these brilliant, perceptive children who noticed everything and felt a swell of pride mixed with concern. He had always taught them to stand tall, to know their worth, but he had also taught them restraint, knowing from hard experience that the world often punished Black people who spoke up no matter how justified their complaints. There's a difference between letting someone get away with something and choosing not to let it consume you, he explained quietly. Sometimes silence is strategy, not surrender. The girls nodded, but Terrence could see they weren't entirely convinced. He didn't blame them. At their age, the world still seemed like it should be fair, that wrongs should be righted. He didn't want to extinguish that belief entirely. It was, after all, what had driven his own success against impossible odds. But he also wanted to protect them from disappointment from the harsh realities he'd faced. Eventually, Heather returned with their drinks, placing them on their trays, without the same care she had shown other passengers. The cold condensation from Amara's apple juice dripped onto her dress as the flight attendant set it down carelessly, but before Terrence could request a napkin, Heather had already moved on. "It's okay," Amara whispered, dabbing at the small wet spot with her sleeve. "I don't mind." But Terrence saw the hurt in her eyes, the early lesson in invisibility being taught to his precious granddaughter, and something inside him ached. He had spent his life building success, amassing wealth and influence, specifically so his family wouldn't have to face the indignities he had. Yet here they were, 3 generations later, still fighting for basic respect. The meal service would begin soon. Terrence hoped things would improve, but the tension in Heather's smile whenever she glanced their way suggested otherwise. The twins had fallen quiet, watching, observing everything with those keen eyes that missed nothing. Terrence could almost see their brilliant minds working, processing this experience, and fitting it into their understanding of the world. He wondered what lessons they would ultimately take from today, and whether they would be the ones he intended to teach them. The meal service began about an hour into the flight. Flight attendants emerged from the galley with trays carefully prepared for first-class passengers. The aroma of warm bread and grilled chicken filled the cabin, as Heather and her colleague distributed meals according to passengers' pre-selected preferences. Once again, the Washington family was served last. By the time Heather approached their row, the other passengers were already halfway through their meals. She placed Zoe's and Amara's children's meals before them without comment, then turned to Terrence. "Red wine with your chicken, correct?" she asked, even though Terrence had specifically requested club soda earlier and had never ordered wine. "No thank you," he corrected politely. "I ordered club soda with lime." Heather's lips tightened. "I must have mixed up the orders. I'll get your club soda after I serve these remaining meals." Terrence nodded, unwilling to make an issue of yet another mistake. The twins exchanged glances again, but followed their grandfather's lead and began eating quietly. 10 minutes passed, then 15, while other passengers finished their meals. Terrence still had no drink. Just as he was about to request it again, Heather appeared with a glass of red wine in hand. Before Terrence could remind her that he'd ordered club soda, she stumbled slightly, just enough for the wine to slosh out of the glass and splash across his custom navy suit, crimson liquid staining the expensive fabric and white shirt. Beneath, "Oh," Heather gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth in what appeared to be shock, though her eyes held something closer to satisfaction. "I am so sorry, sir." Terrence sat perfectly still as the cold liquid soaked through to his skin. Decades of self-control kept his expression neutral, though inside he felt a familiar humiliation, one he'd hoped his granddaughters would never have to witness. "It was an accident," Heather continued, her tone performatively apologetic as she handed him a single cocktail napkin far too small for the spreading stain. these things happen. The entire first-class cabin had fallen silent. All eyes were on Terrence, watching how he would react. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, others curious. A few even seemed faintly amused, as if witnessing the comeuppance of someone who didn't belong. "Thank you," Terrence said quietly, accepting the inadequate napkin. "Perhaps you could bring a few more of these." "We're a bit short on napkins," Heather replied, already turning away. "Maybe you could use the lavatory to clean up." As if to highlight the disparity in treatment at that exact moment, the businessman across the aisle accidentally knocked over his water glass. Within seconds, Heather had rushed over with a stack of napkins, profuse apologies, and offers to have his suit jacket taken for immediate spot cleaning. "I am so terribly sorry, Mr. Donaldson," she gushed, helping him blot the small water stain on his sleeve. "This is completely unacceptable. Please let me know if there's anything else I can do." "Would you like another drink? A different meal, perhaps?" The contrast was stark and unmistakable. Terrence continued dabbing at the massive red wine stain with his single napkin, the expensive fabric already beginning to set, with what would likely be a permanent mark. Grandpa Amara whispered, her eyes wide with indignation. "That's not fair." Life rarely, as Terrence repeated his earlier wisdom, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. Zoe's small hands were balled into fists on her tray table. "She did that on purpose," she said, voice low but fierce. "We can't know that for certain," Terrence cautioned, though he had his suspicions. Heather returned to their row after thoroughly attending to Mr. Donaldson. "You might want to change seats," she suggested to Terrence. "That stain is quite noticeable. There are some open spots in economy where it wouldn't matter as much." The implication was clear. He didn't belong in first class, and his appearance now confirmed it. Terrence felt a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. He had built a billion-dollar company from nothing, created jobs for thousands, and changed educational access for millions of disadvantaged students worldwide. Yet, here he was being treated as less than by someone who likely earned in a year what his company made in seconds. "I'll stay here, thank you," he responded, maintaining his composure. "Though I would appreciate some club soda to help with the stain." Heather nodded curtly and walked away, though whether to fulfill his request remained unclear. The twins had stopped eating their young faces, a mixture of confusion and outrage, as they watched their grandfather sit dignified despite the spreading red stain on his chest. They whispered furiously to each other, heads bent close together in the way that often preceded their most creative problem-solving. Terrence recognized the signs. His granddaughters were plotting something. Normally, he might gently discourage them, but today he found he didn't have the energy to stop whatever was brewing in their brilliant minds. As Terrence considered whether to make his way to the lavatory to attempt cleanup, the captain of the flight, James Reynolds, emerged from the cockpit for a routine cabin check. Captain Reynolds, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a commanding presence, paused as he noticed the commotion and the prominent wine stain on Terrence's suit. His eyes moved from Terrence to the twins, then to Heather, who was now studiously avoiding looking in their direction while chatting warmly with passengers several rows back. The captain's expression shifted, a slight frown appearing between his brows as he seemed to assess the situation. Rather than continue his walkthrough, Captain Reynolds approached the Washington family's row. "Sir," he said respectfully to Terrence, "is everything all right here?" Before Terrence could respond with the diplomatic answer he'd prepared, Zoe spoke up. "No," she said simply. "Everything is not all right." While Terrence excused himself to the lavatory to attempt to salvage his ruined suit, Zoe and Amara exchanged determined looks. For 10 years, they had watched their grandfather navigate a world that often failed to recognize his brilliance and worth. They had listened to his stories about dignity and restraint, about choosing battles wisely, but they had also inherited his strategic mind and sense of justice, just without the decades of conditioning that told him to accept mistreatment quietly. "Operation Respect begins now," Zoe whispered, reaching into her backpack for her tablet. Divide and Document Amara confirmed their predetermined code for situations that required evidence gathering. Zoe nodded her small fingers, already typing rapidly on her device.
I'll research airline policies and passenger rights. You start with witness statements.
The twins had developed this system after witnessing a similar incident at a restaurant 6 months earlier. Their grandfather had been mistaken for a waiter despite wearing a tailored suit, and though he had handled it with characteristic grace, the girls had decided then that they would never again watch passively as he was disrespected. Amara stood first, her innocent face masking a shrewd mind. She approached an older white woman who had been frowning during the wine incident. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said politely. "Did you see what happened to my grandpa?" The woman glanced toward the lavatory where Terrence had disappeared, then back at the earnest child before her. "I did, sweetie. It was very unfortunate." "Do you think it was an accident?" Amara asked, her voice perfectly calibrated between childish curiosity and genuine concern. The woman hesitated. "I couldn't say for certain, but it did seem careless at minimum." Amara nodded thoughtfully. "Would you mind telling me what you saw? My sister and I are keeping track of things that happened to our grandpa."
For a school project, she added, the small lie rolling easily off her tongue.
Meanwhile, Zoe had pulled up the airline's passenger bill of rights and service standards. According to the document, discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or ancestry was explicitly prohibited. She took screenshots, highlighting specific sections about professional conduct expected from crew members. Next, she located the airline's social media accounts, noting the company's recent campaign highlighting their commitment to diversity and inclusion. She took screenshots of these as well, storing everything in a folder labeled Evidence. The girls had learned early from their grandfather about documentation. In business and in life, he would tell them, "Your word might be questioned, but evidence speaks for itself." As Amara continued gathering witness accounts, approaching passengers with a disarming charm only a 10-year-old could manage, Zoe caught the attention of a different flight attendant who was passing through the cabin. "Excuse me," she said, "could you tell me how long Miss Brooks has worked for the airline?" The young male flight attendant looked surprised by the question. "Heather, about 12 years, I think."
"Why do you ask?"
"Just curious," Zoe replied innocently. "Has she won any service awards?" The flight attendant chuckled. "Not that I'm aware of. Between us, she's had a few customer complaints over the years." Zoe nodded, filing away this information. "Thank you for your help." By the time Terrence returned to his seat, his suit still bearing the pink shadow of the wine stain, despite his best efforts, his granddaughters had spoken with 6 passengers and 2 crew members. They had documented the incident from multiple perspectives and compiled a folder of relevant company policies. "What are you two up to?" Terrence asked, noting their flushed cheeks and the tablet Zoe quickly set aside. "Just talking to people," Amara answered vaguely. Terrence raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. After decades in business, he recognized the signs of a strategic operation in progress. Heather had been watching the twins' movements around the cabin with growing suspicion. As Terrence settled back into his seat, she approached their row. "Young ladies," she said firmly, "we need you to remain seated during the flight, unless you're using the lavatory. It's a safety issue." "Actually," Zoe replied, holding up her tablet, "according to the airline's own flight safety guidelines, passengers are permitted to move about the cabin when the seatbelt sign is off, which it currently is." Heather's eyes widened slightly at the child's confident rebuttal. Additionally, Amara chimed in, "We've been monitoring our movements to ensure we don't impede the aisle or disturb other passengers in accordance with Section 4.3 of your in-flight service manual." A businessman 2 rows ahead turned around at this exchange. "The children aren't bothering anyone," he stated, having been one of those Amara had spoken with earlier. "They've been perfectly polite." Heather's face flushed. "Nevertheless, I must insist. Is there a problem here?" Terrence interjected calmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded boardrooms for decades. "Your granddaughters have been wandering the cabin disrupting service." Heather claimed her tone suggesting she still had doubts about their relationship. "We've been gathering witness statements regarding the discriminatory service we've received," Zoe corrected matter-of-factly. which is our right as passengers. Discriminatory, Heather repeated, her voice rising.
That's a very serious accusation, young lady.
Yes, it is, Terrence agreed, placing a protective hand on Zoe's shoulder. And not one my granddaughters would make lightly. All we're asking for is the same professional service extended to other passengers in this cabin. Heather's expression hardened. I think you might be misinterpreting normal service variations as something more sinister, sir. Perhaps first-class service has certain expectations you're not familiar with. The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I've flown first class on over 20 airlines across 6 continents, Terrence stated evenly. I'm quite familiar with the standard of service typically provided. Before Heather could respond, Captain Reynolds appeared again, likely alerted by the escalating tension in the cabin. Is there an issue I should be aware of? He asked, his eyes moving between Heather and the Washington family. No issue, Captain Heather replied quickly, just reminding some passengers about in-flight protocols. Actually, Amara spoke up, her voice clear despite her youth. We've documented multiple instances of differential treatment based on what appears to be racial bias. The captain's eyebrows rose as Zoe held up her tablet, displaying a neatly organized folder labeled Flight 1382 Incident Report, complete with time-stamped notes and passenger statements. We have testimony from 6 passengers and 2 crew members. Zoe explained, her voice steady despite the tension. We also have screenshots of the airline's non-discrimination policy, which appears to have been violated multiple times during this flight. Terrence watched his granddaughters with a complex mixture of pride and concern. He had always taught them to stand up for what was right, but he hadn't expected them to apply those lessons so thoroughly or so soon. Their methodical documentation of the discrimination, something he had experienced countless times but rarely challenged directly, was both impressive and slightly unsettling. Was this the legacy he truly wanted to leave them? The need to document every slight to constantly prove they deserved basic respect? Or was this exactly what they needed to navigate a world that would often fail to recognize their worth at first glance? As the captain absorbed the information the twins presented, Terrence realized this moment would shape not just the remainder of their flight, but potentially his granddaughter's understanding of justice and accountability for years to come. What do you think about the twins' approach? Are they right to document the discrimination their grandfather faced, or should they have followed his example of quiet dignity? Comment number 1. If you believe the girls are teaching their ability, grandfather, an important lesson about standing up for himself. Like this video if you admire Terrence's restraint in the face of prejudice. Subscribe to follow this family's powerful journey toward justice. How would you react if you witnessed this situation on your flight? Have you ever seen someone discriminated against in a service setting? How did the airline staff respond to the twins' evidence? Keep watching to see if Captain Reynolds takes their complaints seriously or dismisses them as the imagination of children. The flight is only halfway to San Francisco, and things are about to get even more intense. Captain Reynolds' Heather began her professional demeanor firmly back in place. These children have been moving throughout the cabin, disturbing passengers and making unfounded accusations. Our accusations are not unfounded, Zoe countered, holding her tablet protectively against her chest. We have documentation. From the mouths of babes, Heather said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Children often misinterpret adult interactions. Captain Reynolds glanced at the wine stain still visible on Terrence's suit. Perhaps we could discuss this privately, he suggested. With all due respect, Captain Terrence replied, his voice calm but firm. Any discussion about how my family has been treated should include us. A middle-aged woman seated across the aisle spoke up unexpectedly. The flight attendant has been treating them differently, all flight. I've been watching since we took off. Mrs. Chen, please, Heather said, clearly flustered by the passenger's intervention. This is a crew matter. It's a human decency matter, Mrs. Chen interrupted. I fly this route twice monthly for business. I've never seen service this poor in first class. Other passengers began murmuring, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable with the confrontation. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted palpably from the usual quiet efficiency of first class to something tense and expectant. "Young ladies," Captain Reynolds addressed the twins directly. "May I see what you've collected?" Zoe hesitated, looking to her grandfather for guidance. Terrence nodded once, and she carefully handed her tablet to the captain. Reynolds scrolled through the meticulous notes, witness statements, and airline policies. The girls had compiled, his expression growing increasingly serious. "This is quite thorough," he acknowledged. Returning the tablet to Zoe. "We believe in proper documentation," she explained simply. Heather's face had flushed an angry red. "They've been soliciting complaints, Captain. Creating a problem where none exists." "The problem existed when you pretended not to see my grandfather," Amara said, her voice quiet but clear. "It existed when you checked his boarding pass like he didn't belong here. It existed when you spilled wine on him and barely apologized." "That was an accident," Heather insisted. "Was it also an accident that you offered Mr. Donaldson a complete cleanup service for water but gave my grandfather one napkin for red wine?" Amara challenged. The businessman in question shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact with everyone involved. "I think," Captain Reynolds said carefully, "we should continue this conversation away from other passengers. Miss Brooks, please come with me. Mr. Washington, would you and your granddaughters join us as well?" As they stood to follow the captain to the galley area, Heather stepped close to Terrence, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "People like you are always looking for special treatment, playing the race card when things don't go your way." She had underestimated the twins' hearing. Both girls stopped abruptly, turning to face her with identical expressions of outrage. "Our grandfather is Terrence Washington," Zoe stated, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "He's receiving the Global Humanitarian Business Award tomorrow for creating educational software that's helped millions of children worldwide. He employs over 4,000 people," Amara added. "He doesn't need special treatment. He deserves basic respect." Several passengers gasped as they recognized the name. Washington Technologies was a household name in the tech industry, and Terrence's philanthropy had been featured in numerous business publications. The Terrence Washington, a young man in business attire, asked incredulously, creator of Access Ed. Terrence, who had always avoided leveraging his status for preferential treatment, looked slightly uncomfortable with the sudden recognition. "Yes, though, that has no bearing on how any passenger should be treated." "It absolutely does not," Captain Reynolds agreed firmly. "Miss Brooks, please come with me now." As Heather followed the captain toward the front galley, her posture rigid with anger, the flight purser approached Terrence and the twins. "Mr. Washington," she said, her expression genuinely apologetic, "I want to personally express how sorry I am for your experience today. Please allow me to offer you a fresh suit from our emergency supply kit, complimentary premium Wi-Fi for your devices, and a voucher for future travel." "That's very kind," Terrence began, but "We don't want vouchers," Amara interrupted, surprising both her grandfather and the purser. "Vouchers won't fix discrimination." "What my granddaughter means," Terrence clarified gently, "is that while we appreciate the gesture, we're more concerned with ensuring that all passengers receive equal treatment regardless of their appearance or status." The purser nodded, though she looked uncertain about how to proceed without her standard script for appeasing dissatisfied passengers. Meanwhile, other passengers had begun discreetly taking photos and sending messages on their phones. The incident was spreading beyond the confines of the aircraft, a fact confirmed moments later when Zoe's tablet chimed with a news alert. "Grandpa," she said, her eyes widening as she read the screen, "someone tweeted about what happened. It's getting shared." Terrence felt a familiar sinking sensation. Throughout his career, he had carefully cultivated a public image focused on his business accomplishments rather than the discrimination he frequently faced. He had intentionally avoided becoming a symbol for racial issues, choosing instead to create change through economic empowerment and education. Now, because of a flight attendant's bias and his granddaughter's sense of justice, he was potentially becoming exactly the kind of figurehead he had avoided being for decades. "It'll be all right," he assured Zoe, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. After several minutes, Captain Reynolds returned without Heather. In her place was a different flight attendant, a middle-aged black woman who introduced herself as Patricia. "Mr. Washington, Miss Brooks has been reassigned to economy service for the remainder of the flight," Captain Reynolds explained. "Patricia will be taking over first-class service. I've also filed an initial incident report based on the information your granddaughters provided." "Thank you," Captain Terrence replied. "I appreciate your prompt attention to this matter." "It's the least we can do," Reynolds said, looking genuinely regretful. "This isn't the experience we want any of our passengers to have." As they returned to their seats, Patricia quickly brought fresh drinks and warm towels to help with the remaining wine stain. Her service was impeccably professional to everyone, with no hint of the differential treatment Heather had displayed. "Is it over now?" Amara asked quietly as they settled back in. Terrence glanced at his tablet, which was now receiving a steady stream of notifications as the incident gained traction on social media. Washington Technology's PR team had already sent 3 increasingly urgent messages requesting details. "No, sweetheart," he replied honestly. "I think it's just beginning." As the plane began its initial descent into San Francisco, Heather reappeared briefly at the front of the cabin to collect items for landing. She caught Terrence's eye momentarily, her expression cold with resentment. Whatever reprimand she had received had clearly done nothing to change her perspective. Terrence held her gaze steadily, neither challenging nor submissive. After a lifetime of such encounters, he recognized that some minds simply refused to change. But as he looked at his granddaughters, these brilliant, fierce girls who had refused to accept the status quo, he wondered if perhaps his own approach had been too accommodating all these years. "You've given me something to think about," he told them softly as the plane descended through the clouds toward San Francisco. "Perhaps an old man can still learn new strategies." The twins beamed at him, pride evident in their matching smiles. They had stood up not just for their grandfather, but for a principle larger than themselves. In doing so, they had given him a precious gift, the possibility that future generations might not need to swallow their dignity to succeed in a biased world. As the wheels touched down on California soil, Terrence realized this award ceremony weekend had already become more meaningful than he could have anticipated, though not in any way he would have predicted. The moment they disembarked from the aircraft, Terrence could feel the situation expanding beyond his control. Patricia, the replacement flight attendant, had discreetly informed him that airline representatives would be waiting to speak with him at the gate. His phone was vibrating constantly with messages from his company's PR team board members and even several journalists who had somehow obtained his private number. Sir Captain Reynolds said quietly as they paused in the jet bridge, "I want to personally apologize again. What happened today was unacceptable." "I appreciate that," Captain Terrence replied, keeping a protective arm around each of his granddaughters. "The airline's customer relations director is waiting to speak with you," Reynolds continued. "They're taking this very seriously." Terrence nodded, unsurprised. A viral social media incident involving a black billionaire being discriminated against was exactly the kind of PR nightmare corporations dreaded. He had been on the other side of similar situations, as a CEO, managing his company's responses to employee misconduct. He understood the playbook that was about to unfold. Sure enough, as they entered the terminal, a polished woman in a tailored suit approached them, flanked by 2 equally polished colleagues. "Mr. Washington," she greeted him with professional warmth. "I'm Victoria Hartwell, Senior Director of Customer Relations for the airline. On behalf of everyone at our company, I want to express our deepest apologies for your experience today." Before Terrence could respond, Zoe stepped slightly forward. "Are you apologizing because of what happened or because people are tweeting about it?" Victoria blinked, clearly taken aback by the direct question from a child. Well, we take all customer complaints seriously, regardless of social media attention." "Then why were there 17 previous complaints about Miss Brooks' behavior toward passengers of color with no disciplinary action taken?" Zoe asked, looking at her tablet. Terrence and Victoria both stared at her in surprise. How did you, Victoria, began? LinkedIn shows you've been in your position for 3 years, Zoe explained. During that time, public records of discrimination complaints filed with the Department of Transportation show 17 incidents involving your airline's first-class cabin on domestic routes. Cross-referencing with crew assignments available through public flight data, Miss Brooks appears as crew on 14 of those flights. Victoria's professional composure faltered momentarily. Terrence felt a complex surge of emotions, pride in his granddaughter's research skills, concern about her precociousness, and a sudden realization that he had underestimated just how thoroughly the twins had been documenting this situation. Young Lady Victoria said, recovering quickly, those records don't necessarily indicate. We're not interested in debating the past, Terrence intervened, placing a gentle hand on Zoe's shoulder. We're interested in ensuring that no passenger faces similar treatment in the future. Victoria nodded gratefully at the redirection. Absolutely, Mr. Washington. We would like to offer you our sincere apologies, a full refund of today's travel complimentary first-class tickets for your next journey, and a VIP service package for a year. And what about addressing the systemic issues? Amara asked, her voice clear and confident. Grandfather always says that compensating for individual problems without addressing root causes is just public relations, not problem solving. Terrence couldn't help but smile slightly. The twins had clearly been paying attention during his business discussions at home. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. We take diversity and inclusion very seriously. Then you'll be implementing mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff, reviewing your complaint response procedures, and establishing clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. Amara continued as if she were the conducted CEO rather than a 10-year-old. And publishing transparency reports on discrimination complaints and resolutions, Zoe added. Victoria looked from the twins to Terrence, clearly hoping he would rein them in. Instead, he simply raised an eyebrow, waiting for her response. Those are very specific requests, Victoria managed. They're reasonable expectations, Terrence corrected gently. And they would demonstrate that your company is genuinely committed to improvement rather than damage control. One of Victoria's colleagues whispered something in her ear, showing her a phone screen that presumably displayed the growing social media attention. Her expression shifted subtly as she assessed the situation. We would be happy to discuss implementing such measures, she conceded. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting with our executive team during your stay in San Francisco. Terrence was about to agree when his own phone chimed with a priority message. It was from Madison Chen, Washington Technologies, Chief Legal Officer. Don't agree to anything or sign anything. Social media is exploding. Major news outlets picking up the story. We're flying in tonight. We'll meet you at the hotel. The situation was clearly escalating beyond a simple customer service issue. While Terrence had hoped to handle this quietly and focus on his award ceremony, it seemed the incident had touched a nerve with the public. I'll have my team contact yours to arrange a discussion, he told Victoria diplomatically. For now, we need to get to our hotel. My granddaughters have had a long day. Victoria appeared relieved to end the confrontation. Of course. We've arranged a private car service for you. Again, Mr. Washington, we deeply regret today's incident. As they were escorted to the waiting vehicle, Terrence checked his phone again. The story had indeed gone viral, with major news outlets already publishing articles with headlines like "Billionaire CEO Faces Discrimination in First Class" and "One 0-year-old Twins Stand Up to Airline Racism." Meanwhile, the twins were huddled together over Zoe's tablet, occasionally whispering and nodding. Terrence recognized their focused expressions. They were still working on their project. "What are you two plotting now?" he asked, as they settled into the luxury SUV. "We've contacted Washington Technologies' PR team," Amara explained matter-of-factly. "We sent them all our documentation and suggested a response strategy." Terrence stared at his granddaughters in astonishment. "You did what?" "It's okay, Grandpa," Zoe assured him. "We emphasize that the focus should be on systemic change, not punishing Miss Brooks or damaging the airline's reputation unnecessarily." "This isn't about revenge," Amara added solemnly. "It's about accountability." Terrence leaned back against the leather seat, momentarily speechless. These children, barely a decade old, had not only documented discrimination with the thoroughness of seasoned civil rights attorneys, but had also begun orchestrating a corporate response with the strategic thinking of experienced executives. "You know," he said finally, "I spent most of my career trying to succeed without making waves. I thought that was the best way to create change, to become so successful they couldn't ignore me, but to do it quietly enough that I didn't threaten the status quo." The twins listened intently, their identical brown eyes fixed on his face. "I believed that economic power would eventually translate to social equality," he continued. "That if I built enough wealth and created enough opportunities for others, the discrimination would gradually disappear." "Did it work?" Zoe asked simply. Terrence glanced down at his still-stained suit, a visible reminder that even billions of dollars hadn't protected him from being humiliated for the color of his skin. "Not as well as I hoped," he admitted. "But I'm beginning to think your generation might have better strategies." As their car navigated through San Francisco traffic toward the luxury hotel where they would be staying, Terrence's phone rang. It was the Washington Technologies PR director, sounding slightly frazzled. "Mr. Washington, we've received some very detailed documentation from your granddaughters. Their email was quite comprehensive." Despite the stress of the situation, Terrence chuckled. "Yes, they've been quite thorough."
"Sir, this incident is gaining significant traction. Major news outlets are requesting statements. Social media engagement is off the charts. We need to discuss our approach immediately."
Terrence looked at his granddaughters, who were watching him expectantly. For decades, he had carefully avoided becoming a symbol in racial discussions, preferring to create change through economic empowerment rather than public advocacy. But perhaps it was time for a different approach. "Set up a conference call with the executive team for this evening," he instructed, "and include my granddaughters. They've earned a seat at the table for this discussion." As he ended the call, Terrence felt an unexpected sense of liberation. Throughout his career, he had carried the burden of representation, knowing that as one of few black CEOs in the tech industry, his every move was scrutinized and his every misstep could reinforce negative stereotypes. That burden had shaped his responses to discrimination, leading him to choose silence and dignity over confrontation and justice. But watching his granddaughters, these brilliant, fearless girls who saw injustice and immediately moved to document and challenge it, he wondered if perhaps his approach had been too cautious. If, in his effort to succeed within the system, he had inadvertently helped perpetuate it. Grandpa Amara said, interrupting his thoughts, "Are you mad at us?" Terrence pulled both girls closer to him. "No, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. Both of you. You saw something wrong and you took action. That takes courage." "We just did what you taught us," Zoe replied. "You always say that change requires evidence, strategy, and persistence." "So I do," Terrence agreed, smiling despite the circumstances, "though I'm not sure I expected you to apply those lessons quite so dramatically." The car pulled up to their hotel, where several photographers were already waiting news of their arrival, having somehow preceded them. The story was growing faster than anyone had anticipated, transforming from a personal indignity into a public conversation about race, wealth, and accountability. As they were quickly escorted through a side entrance to avoid the cameras, Terrence realized that his carefully cultivated privacy had been irrevocably altered. Tomorrow's awards ceremony, which should have been a simple acknowledgement of his business and philanthropic achievements, would now take place in the shadow of this incident. The question was, would he try to minimize it and return to his usual approach of quiet dignity? Or would he follow his granddaughter's example and use this unexpected platform to demand more substantive change? As the elevator ascended to their penthouse suite, Terrence Washington, a man who had built an empire by making the right strategic decisions, found himself facing perhaps the most consequential choice of his public life. The presidential suite at the Grand Pacific Hotel offered a stunning panoramic view of San Francisco Bay, but Terrence barely noticed the scenery. For the past hour, he had been on a conference call with his executive team, legal counsel, and public relations staff, all while his granddaughters sat quietly nearby, occasionally passing him handwritten notes with surprisingly insightful suggestions. The airline's lawyers have already contacted us, Madison Chen Washington, Technology's chief legal officer, was explaining. They're offering a very generous settlement package, including a substantial donation to your educational foundation. In exchange for confidentiality, I presume Terrence replied, already knowing the answer. Complete confidentiality, yes, Madison confirmed. They're extremely motivated to resolve this quickly and quietly. Terrence glanced at the twins, who were shaking their heads in synchronized disapproval. Amara slid a note across the coffee table. Money doesn't fix systems. What about their policies? Terrence asked, picking up his granddaughter's point. Have they indicated any willingness to implement meaningful changes to prevent similar incidents? There was a pause on the line. They've mentioned reviewing their training programs, Madison said carefully, but nothing specific or binding. So they want to pay us to be silent, with no guarantee that other passengers won't face the same discrimination, Terrence summarized. Mr. Washington interjected. Derek Powell, the PR director, from a publicity standpoint, accepting their offer might be the cleanest resolution. This story is gaining tremendous momentum. We've tracked over 50,000 social media mentions in the past 3 hours alone. Major networks want interviews. If we don't control the narrative soon, this could overshadow tomorrow's award ceremony entirely. Terrence understood the concern. The Global Humanitarian Business Award was among the most prestigious recognitions in the corporate world, celebrating companies that had made exceptional contributions to human welfare. Washington Technologies had earned it through years of developing accessible educational software and distributing it freely to underserved communities worldwide. Having that accomplishment eclipsed by an incident of personal discrimination would be deeply frustrating. Yet something about simply accepting compensation and moving on felt insufficient, especially with his granddaughters watching his every decision. What are our alternatives? He asked. We could issue a statement acknowledging the incident and announcing that you're in discussions with the airline about improving their practices, suggested Alicia Rodriguez, the company's director of community relations. Position this as an opportunity to create industry-wide change rather than focusing on the personal affront. Terrence nodded thoughtfully. That aligns more with our company values. There's something else you should know, Madison added, her tone shifting. The flight attendant Heather Brooks has already been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The airline is clearly preparing to make her the scapegoat for this incident. Zoe, who had been listening intently, spoke up unexpectedly. But she's not the only problem. All conversation on the speakerphone halted at the sound of the child's voice. Zoe, sweetheart, Terrence began gently. The adults are having a business discussion. But they're missing important data, she persisted, approaching the phone with tablet in hand. May I speak, please? After a moment's hesitation, Terrence nodded. This is Zoe Washington. She introduced herself with surprising professionalism. My sister and I have been researching Miss Brooks's employment history and the airline's response to previous discrimination complaints. Our findings suggest a pattern of institutional failure rather than isolated employee misconduct. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Go on, Madison finally said, curiosity evident in her voice. Over the past 5 years, the airline has received 43 formal complaints regarding racial discrimination in premium cabins. Zoe continued reading from her tablet. Only 3 resulted in any documented disciplinary action. Miss Brooks was the subject of 14 complaints, but received only 1 formal reprimand. How did you access this information? Derek asked, sounding both impressed and concerned. Public records requests, Department of Transportation Consumer Complaint Database cross-referenced with flight schedules and crew assignments available through aviation enthusiast forums, Amara explained, joining her sister. Plus some passenger accounts we found on social media and review sites. Another lengthy silence followed. Mr. Washington, Madison said, finally, your granddaughters appear to have compiled a stronger case of systemic discrimination than the airline's settlement offer acknowledges. Yes, Terrence agreed, looking at the twins with newfound appreciation. They certainly have. Before they could continue the discussion, a hotel staff member knocked on the suite door, announcing that representatives from the airline had arrived in the lobby requesting an immediate meeting. They've sent their chief operating officer and general counsel, the concierge, informed them. They're quite insistent on speaking with you tonight. Terrence exchanged glances with his granddaughters. Tell them I'll meet with them in 30 minutes in the hotel's executive conference room. After the staff member departed, Terrence returned to the call. My team, I need your advice. The airline executives are here, apparently unwilling to wait until tomorrow. They're panicking, Madison assessed. Social media pressure is mounting, and they want to contain this before the morning news cycle. Which gives us leverage, Alicia pointed out. But is leverage what we want? Terrence questioned more to himself than his team. Throughout his career, he had been strategic about choosing his battles, careful not to be perceived as an activist or troublemaker. That approach had served him well in building his company, but had it served the broader community? Had his silence enabled the very systems his granddaughters were now so eagerly challenging? The twins watched him intently, seemingly aware that their grandfather was at a crossroads. I need to consider what message my response sends to my granddaughters, Terrence said finally, and to all the children who will face similar situations in their lives. We understand, sir, Madison replied respectfully. What would you like us to do? Madison drafts settlement terms that focus on systemic changes rather than monetary compensation, Terrence instructed. Derek, prepare 2 press statements, one for if we reach an agreement, one for if we don't. Alicia, I want you to coordinate with our foundation to develop a corporate training program on service industry discrimination. The airline may become our first client. After ending the call, Terrence turned to his granddaughters. You two have started something significant here. I hope you realize that. We just wanted them to treat you with respect, Amara said simply. And to be accountable, Zoe added. Terrence smiled, feeling a surge of pride mixed with a touch of regret for all the times he had chosen not to confront similar treatment. Well, you've certainly accomplished that. Now I have a meeting to prepare for, and you two should get ready for bed. It's been a long day. But we want to come to the meeting, they protested in unison. Terrence considered their request. Conventionally, children would have no place in such a high-level corporate negotiation. But these were not conventional children, and their research and documentation had created this opportunity in the first place. All right, he conceded, but you'll observe only. This is still an adult business discussion. 20 minutes later, dressed in a fresh suit from his luggage, Terrence entered the hotel's wood-paneled executive conference room with the twins following close behind. Waiting for them were Bernard Mitchell, the airline's chief operating officer, and Elaine Winters, their general counsel. Mr. Washington Mitchell greeted him with forced cordiality, his eyes darting nervously to the twins. We appreciate you meeting with us on such short notice. These are my granddaughters, Zoe and Amara Terrence. Introduce them. They'll be observing our discussion. Neither airline executive looked pleased by this announcement, but neither objected. Mr. Washington Winters began opening a sleek leather portfolio. We want to express our profound regret regarding today's unfortunate incident. We've prepared a comprehensive settlement package that we believe adequately addresses your concerns. She slid a document across the table. Terrence glanced at it briefly, noting the substantial financial offer and boilerplate confidentiality clauses before setting it aside. Miss Winters, Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your prompt attention to this matter, he said. However, I'm not interested in financial compensation or confidentiality agreements. The executives exchanged concerned glances. What are you interested in? Mr. Washington Mitchell asked cautiously. Systemic change, Terrence replied simply. My granddaughters have compiled extensive documentation suggesting today's incident wasn't an isolated occurrence, but part of a pattern of inadequately addressed discrimination within your company. Winter's professional demeanor faltered slightly. We would caution against making such broad allegations based on limited 14 prior complaints against the same flight attendant with minimal disciplinary response, Zoe interrupted, unable to remain silent. 43 total discrimination complaints in premium cabins over 5 years with only 3 resulting in documented action. That's not an allegation. It's a pattern." Mitchell stared at the child, clearly taken aback by her precise knowledge of their internal issues. "How did you—" "The data is publicly available if you know where to look," Amara explained. Terrence intervened gently. "The point is not to embarrass your company or to target any individual employee. The point is to create meaningful change so that no passenger faces similar treatment in the future." "What exactly are you proposing?" Winters asked, her tone more cautious now. Terrence outlined his conditions: a comprehensive review of the airline's discrimination complaint procedures, mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff, clear consequences for discriminatory behavior, and quarterly public reporting on progress. Additionally, he concluded, "Rather than paying me, I suggest you fund a service industry inclusion initiative through the Washington Educational Foundation. We'll develop training programs that could benefit your entire industry." The airline executives appeared surprised by the proposal, clearly having expected demands for personal compensation or punitive measures. "This is unconventional," Mitchell admitted. "It's forward-thinking," Terrence corrected, "and it transforms an unfortunate incident into an opportunity for genuine improvement." As the discussion continued into the night, the twins eventually dozed off on a sofa in the corner of the conference room. Looking at them, these brilliant children who had forced him to reconsider his own approach to confronting discrimination, Terrence felt renewed purpose in his negotiations. By midnight, they had reached a preliminary agreement that satisfied both parties. The airline would implement the systemic changes Terrence had requested, and Washington Technologies would help develop the training programs. No confidentiality clause would prevent discussion of the incident, though both parties agreed to focus public statements on the positive changes emerging from it, rather than dwelling on the negative experience. As Terrence carried his sleeping granddaughters back to their suite, he reflected on the day's unexpected journey. What had begun as a humiliating experience had transformed into potentially his most significant contribution to social change, not through his own actions, but through the courage and determination of two 10-year-old girls who refused to accept the status quo he had tolerated for decades. Tomorrow's award ceremony would recognize his business accomplishments, but perhaps his most important legacy would be these extraordinary children and the more just world they were already helping to create. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel glittered with the combined wealth and influence of the global business elite. Executives in bespoke suits and designer gowns mingled over champagne, their collective net worth rivaling the GDP of a small nation. This annual gathering for the Global Humanitarian Business Award represented corporate philanthropy at its most prestigious. A celebration of companies using their resources to address humanitarian challenges. Under normal circumstances, Terrence would have approached this evening with quiet pride, satisfied to have his company's educational initiatives recognized by his peers. But tonight was far from normal. News of the airline incident had spread throughout the business community, transforming Terrence's presence from merely notable to the center of attention. "You look very handsome, Grandpa," Amara said, straightening his bow tie as they prepared to enter the ballroom. Both girls wore matching midnight blue dresses, their hair styled in elegant braids adorned with silver clips. "And you two look absolutely beautiful," Terrence replied, marveling at how poised they appeared despite the extraordinary events of the past 24 hours. Washington Technologies' PR team had worked through the night to manage the still unfolding story. The compromise reached with the airline had been announced that morning, focusing on the systemic changes agreed upon rather than the incident itself, but social media continued to buzz with commentary and news outlets were still requesting interviews. Remember, Terrence reminded the twins as they approached the entrance tonight, is about the educational work our company has done. Let's try to keep the focus there. Of course, Grandpa Zoe agreed, though her expression suggested she had her own ideas about the evening's significance. As they entered the ballroom, Terrence immediately noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere conversations. Pausing momentarily, glances directed their way, whispers behind cocktail glasses. He had experienced similar reactions throughout his career, as often the only black executive in such spaces, but tonight felt different. There was curiosity, certainly, but also something that resembled respect. Eleanor Bradford, the chairwoman of the Global Business Humanitarian Initiative, approached them immediately.
Terrence, we're so pleased you could join us, especially after yesterday's unfortunate incident.
Her eyes flickered with interest to the twins. And these must be the remarkable young ladies we've been hearing about. My granddaughters, Zoe and Amara Terrence, confirmed, noting with amusement how the girls straightened their postures at being acknowledged. What you've accomplished is truly impressive, Eleanor told them sincerely. Both with your grandfather's company and, more recently. Before they could respond, Terrence noticed a familiar figure approaching William Pearson, the CEO of the airline he had flown yesterday. His presence was unexpected. Pearson hadn't been on the original guest list. Mr. Washington Pearson greeted him with an outstretched hand. "I hoped I might have a word with you before the ceremony begins." Terrence shook the offered hand, keeping his expression neutral. Of course. Eleanor tactfully excused herself, promising to catch up with them later. As she departed, Pearson turned his attention to the twins. "You must be Zoe and Amara," he said, his tone careful but not condescending. "Your research skills are quite remarkable. Our legal department was quite impressed." The twins acknowledged the compliment with small nods, but remained watchful, protective of their grandfather, even in this opulent setting. "Perhaps we could speak privately for a moment," Pearson suggested to Terrence, glancing meaningfully at a quieter corner of the ballroom. "My granddaughters stay with me," Terrence replied firmly. "Anything you wish to discuss can be said in their presence." Pearson appeared momentarily surprised, but acquiesced. "Very well. I wanted to personally extend my apologies for yesterday's incident. It falls far below the standard of service we aspire to provide." "I appreciate that," Terrence said simply. "I've also reviewed the agreement you reached with our executives last night," Pearson continued. "While I find the terms unusual, I respect your approach. Most in your position would have demanded significant personal compensation." "Money doesn't solve systemic problems," Terrence replied, unconsciously echoing Amara's note from the previous evening. "Structural changes do." Pearson nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "Our legal team has prepared additional documentation for your review. A more conventional settlement, including an NDA regarding specific details of the incident. The systemic changes you requested would still proceed, of course." The implication was clear. They were still hoping to minimize public discussion of the discrimination itself, even while implementing the requested reforms. Before Terrence could respond, Zoe spoke up. "Is Miss Brooks still employed by your airline?" Pearson appeared startled by the direct question from a child. "That's a personnel matter that—" "She's going to be fired, isn't she?" Amara interrupted. "Made into the scapegoat while the system that enabled her behavior continues." "Young lady, these matters are more complex than they might appear," Pearson began, his tone slipping into condescension. "They're not complex at all," Zoe countered. 14 complaints, 1 reprimand. That's not individual failure. That's systemic permission." Pearson's expression tightened, clearly unprepared for such direct confrontation from a 10-year-old. He turned back to Terrence. "Your granddaughters are certainly outspoken." "They're observant and principled," Terrence corrected, placing a protective hand on each of their shoulders. "And they've helped me realize that accepting quiet settlements might address individual injustices but perpetuates the systems that create them." He returned to Pearson's original offer. "I won't be signing any NDA. The changes we've agreed upon should stand on their own merits, not as a confidential arrangement to protect your company's image." Pearson's professionally pleasant expression faltered. "Mr. Washington, I urge you to reconsider. Our board is prepared to make a substantial donation to your foundation." "My grandfather doesn't need your money," Amara stated, her voice clear and carrying just far enough to draw attention from nearby conversations. Terrence squeezed her shoulder gently, a reminder to modulate her volume rather than her message. "What my granddaughter means," he clarified, "is that my foundation is already well funded. What would benefit society more is genuine corporate accountability and transparency. Pearson seemed about to argue further when the ceremony coordinator approached, informing Terrence that the award presentation would begin soon and he should take his place near the stage. With a final, meaningful glance at Pearson, Terrence guided his granddaughters toward their assigned table near the front of the ballroom. "Did we mess up?" Grandpa Amara whispered as they walked away. "Were we too direct?" "No, sweetheart," Terrence assured her. "You were honest and principled. Sometimes that makes people uncomfortable, especially when they're used to solving problems with money rather than meaningful change." As they took their seats, Terrence noticed several prominent business leaders stopping by to greet them. Some he knew well, others he had only met in passing at previous events. The conversation inevitably turned to the airline incident, with many expressing support for his handling of the situation. A few even shared similar experiences they had faced but chosen not to publicize. "You've started something important," remarked Janet Kwan, CEO of a major tech company and one of the few other Black executives in the room. "My team has already scheduled a review of our own customer service training programs based on this morning's announcement." Before long, the formal ceremony began. Eleanor Bradford took the stage to welcome the attendees and explain the significance of the Global Humanitarian Business Award. As she spoke about corporate responsibility and ethical leadership, Terrence reviewed the acceptance speech he had prepared days earlier, a gracious acknowledgement of his team's work developing educational software for underserved communities. It now felt inadequate, disconnected from the unexpected journey of the past 24 hours. And now, Eleanor announced, "It is my great pleasure to present this year's Global Humanitarian Business Award to Terrence Washington, founder and CEO of Washington Technologies." Applause filled the ballroom as Terrence rose from his seat. The twins gave him encouraging smiles, their pride evident in their matching brown eyes. As he approached the podium, he made a decision, setting aside his prepared remarks to speak from his heart instead. "Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you to the Global Business Humanitarian Initiative for this recognition," he began traditionally enough. "When I started Washington Technologies 30 years ago, my goal was simple: create educational tools that would help level the playing field for all students, regardless of their background or circumstances." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Mostly white, mostly privileged. Many genuinely committed to making a difference in the world. His gaze found his granddaughters watching him with absolute confidence in his ability to rise to this moment. "I had planned to talk to you tonight about our educational initiatives about the millions of students who have benefited from our free software programs in underserved communities worldwide. And that work is indeed important, worthy of celebration and continued support." Another pause, longer this time. "But something happened yesterday that has forced me to reconsider my approach to creating change in our society. Many of you have heard about the incident on my flight to San Francisco. What you may not know is that it was my 10-year-old granddaughters who turned that moment of personal humiliation into an opportunity for institutional change." He gestured toward Zoe and Amara, who sat up straighter as attention turned to them. "Throughout my career, I've believed that the best way to combat discrimination was through economic success and quiet dignity. I built a billion-dollar company, created thousands of jobs, and developed technologies that have helped millions, all while carefully avoiding being labeled an activist or troublemaker." Murmurs rippled through the audience as executives shifted in their seats, some nodding in recognition of the delicate balance Terrence described. "Yesterday, I watched as my granddaughters took a different approach. They documented discrimination methodically. They researched corporate policies and previous complaints. They gathered witness statements and compiled evidence. They weren't satisfied with private apologies or financial settlements. They demanded systemic accountability and transparency." He smiled, a mixture of pride and humility crossing his features. And they were right to do so. Because while individual success can create individual opportunity, it doesn't automatically change the systems that perpetuate inequality. Sometimes those systems need to be directly confronted and rebuilt. The ballroom had grown completely silent, every eye fixed on Terrence as he departed further from the expected script of grateful acceptance. So while I am deeply honored by this award recognizing Washington Technology's humanitarian work, I am even more proud today to announce a new initiative inspired by my granddaughter's courage and insight. He outlined his plan to expand the Washington Educational Foundation's mission to include corporate training programs on recognizing and addressing systemic discrimination in customer service industries. The airline would be their first partner, but the curriculum would be made available to any company willing to commit to transparent improvement. Because true humanitarianism isn't just about donating resources to worthy causes, Terrence concluded. It's about creating systems where dignity and respect are accorded to every human being as a matter of course, not as a special privilege for those with wealth or status. As applause erupted throughout the ballroom, some enthusiastic, some more measured but respectful, Terrence caught sight of Pearson's face in the crowd. The airline CEO looked thoughtful, perhaps realizing that the Washington family's approach offered his company not just a challenge, but an opportunity for meaningful improvement. Returning to his seat with the Crystal Award in hand, Terrence found his granddaughters beaming with pride. "You went off script," Grandpa Zoe whispered, sounding impressed. "I learned from the best," he replied, pulling them both into a gentle embrace. Sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected teachers. As the ceremony continued, Terrence reflected on how dramatically his perspective had shifted in just 24 hours. For decades, he had believed that success within the system was the most effective path to change. Now, guided by two 10-year-old visionaries, he was discovering the power of directly challenging that system instead. The award in his hands recognized his past achievements, but his granddaughters had shown him a new path forward, one that might ultimately prove far more significant than anything he had accomplished before. 6 months later, Terrence Washington sat in his Chicago office, reviewing the quarterly progress report from the airline's newly established Office of Passenger Equity. The document detailed significant changes implemented since the incident: comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff, revamped complaint procedures with clear accountability metrics, and transparent public reporting on discrimination allegations and resolutions. Most impressively, complaints of discriminatory treatment had decreased by 37% in the first quarter after implementation, while customer satisfaction scores among minority passengers had increased by 22%. The airline was now being recognized as an industry leader in inclusive service practices. Heather Brooks had indeed been terminated shortly after the incident, but the process had not ended there. Rather than simply removing the problem employee, the airline had conducted a thorough review of how she had remained in her position despite multiple complaints. 3 supervisors were reassigned after investigators discovered a pattern of dismissed or downgraded discrimination reports. More surprisingly, Heather herself had undergone something of a transformation. After her initial anger and denial, she had eventually reached out to Washington Technology's new training program, volunteering to share her perspective as part of the curriculum. "I never saw myself as racist," she explained in a recorded interview used in training sessions. "I thought I was just upholding standards. It took losing my job to realize how my biases were affecting my behavior." The twins had remained actively involved in the development of the Dignity in Service training program, consulting regularly with the Foundation's educational experts to ensure the curriculum addressed the subtle forms of discrimination they had observed. Their insights had proven invaluable in creating materials that resonated with frontline service workers. "Children see things clearly," Terrence often remarked during presentations about the program. "They haven't yet learned to normalize or excuse discrimination the way many adults have." Washington Technologies had experienced unexpected benefits from the incident as well. Applications from minority candidates had increased significantly, with many citing the company's response to the discrimination as their motivation for applying. The stock price had risen 12% since the announcement of the new initiative, suggesting that investors valued the company's leadership in corporate social responsibility. Most meaningful to Terrence, however, was the transformation in his relationship with his granddaughters. Where once he had tried to teach them patience and restraint in the face of discrimination, he now found himself learning from their unyielding insistence on justice and accountability. He told them one evening as they prepared to board another flight, this time for a family vacation, "I spent decades building wealth to create opportunities and protection for our family. But you two have shown me that true protection comes from changing the systems themselves." The difference in their travel experience was immediately apparent. From check-in to boarding, every staff member treated them with the same professional courtesy extended to all passengers. No double-checking of boarding passes, no surprised looks, no differential service. "Do you think it's because they recognize you now?" Grandpa Amara asked as they settled into their seats. "Because you're famous." Terrence considered the question. "Perhaps some of them do recognize me, but I prefer to believe it's because we help change the culture, not just at this airline, but across the industry. Small ripples can create big waves." As their plane took off, Terrence watched his granddaughters pull out their tablets, noting with amusement that they were documenting this flight experience as well, continuing their project of collecting stories of discrimination and progress in everyday interactions. What had begun as a humiliating incident had transformed into something far more significant, a new chapter in Terrence's already impressive legacy, focusing not just on creating economic opportunity, but on demanding systemic accountability and respect. Grandpa Zoe said, interrupting his thoughts, "Do you think we made a difference for other people too, not just for us?" Terrence smiled at his brilliant, compassionate granddaughter. "I know we did, sweetheart. And that's the most important kind of success there is." This story teaches us that confronting discrimination requires both courage and strategy. While Terrence achieved success through quiet dignity and economic empowerment, his granddaughters showed that documentation, accountability, and transparency are equally powerful tools for creating systemic change. The twins demonstrated that age doesn't determine impact. Their methodical approach forced an entire corporation to address long-standing issues. We learned that true progress comes not just from individual success, but from transforming the systems that enable discrimination. Most importantly, this story reminds us that different generations bring complementary wisdom to the fight for equality. Sometimes we need the patience and perspective of experience. Other times we need the clarity and moral certainty of youth unwilling to accept injustice as normal. By combining these approaches, we can create more lasting change than either could accomplish alone. What moments in this story resonated most with you? Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination in a service setting? How did you respond? Comment below and share your thoughts on whether you would have handled the situation more like Terrence, with quiet dignity, or like the twins, with active documentation and accountability. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories about overcoming adversity and fighting for justice. Hit that like button if you believe children can sometimes see injustice more clearly than adults. Share this video with someone who needs inspiration to stand up against discrimination in their daily life. Thank you for watching. And remember, change happens when we refuse to accept injustice as normal.